We're continuing our appreciation of Paul McCartney's music through the decades. In the 1960s, his music is featured on 13 albums and 3 notable singles. In the 1970s, his music appears on 18 albums. Now we're going to turn to the 1980s and see what Paul has up his sleeve. Now, as always, there's a lot of music. So again, I'll be breaking this into 2 episodes. First, concentrating on the music from 1980 to 1985 that Paul has made. Are you ready? Let's go back in time. Let's drop the needle. Now, at the end of 1979, we saw how Apple released an album called Rarities. Capitol looked at that and went, that's a good idea, but we don't want to release that album because those songs weren't really rarities in the US because Capitol had already released them on previous records. So they decide they'll make their own version of Rarities, which will be songs that were more rare in the US. So the albums are vastly different. Here are the tracks on the UK and the US version so you can see the differences. Now, when we look at Sgt. Pepper Inner Groove, this rare piece was included in the English pressing of Sgt. Pepper, but not in the US version. It's a few seconds of a 15 kilohertz tone that really only dogs can hear, and 2 seconds of laughter and noise on the run-out groove of the album. The album also had a gatefold, which when opened shows the butcher cover from the original pressing of Yesterday and Today. The album reaches 21 in the US. After Paul's release from jail in Japan, he returns to England and decides that he'll record another solo album. And like his first album, McCartney, on this one, he's going to play all the instruments himself. And this one also really relies heavily on synthesizers. And it's called McCartney II. The album was released in May of 1980. The record is quite experimental, and Paul has said he was inspired by, among others, John Cage. It has 3 hit singles, Coming Up, The Strangely Odd Temporary Secretary, and The Beautiful Waterfalls. Critics did not like this album. They thought the songs were all very lightweight, and it remains one of Paul's least-selling albums to this point. It takes Paul 2 years to record his next album, and in 1982, he releases Tug of War. And it's the first music he's put out since John Lennon was murdered. And he reunites with George Martin to produce the record. There are a number of guest appearances on this album, notably Stevie Wonder, Carl Perkins, and good old Ringo Starr. Tracks include Tug of War, the single Take It Away, What's That You're Doing with Stevie Wonder, Here Today, Paul's song about John now that he no longer can talk to him, Ballroom Dancing, Wonderlust, Get With It with Carl Perkins, and Ebony and Ivory with Stevie Wonder. Critics love this record and say, once again, Paul's returning to form, and it goes to number 1 both in the US and the UK. Also in 1982, Capitol decides to release another Beatles compilation album called Real Music, and this contains music from the Beatles films. Here are the tracks, and many are released in stereo for the first time in the US. It reaches number 19 in the US and 56 in the UK. Along with the album, Capitol released a single called Beatles Movie Melody, which was a medley of Beatles songs. In the UK, the label initially refused to release it, saying it was deemed as being tacky. But the US single was a hit, so Parlophone finally released it in the UK. It was the first Beatles single released in the 1980s. But Capitol's not done. In October of 1982, they release another compilation, which is called 20 Greatest Hits. In 1983, Paul releases an album called Pipes of Peace. Now, many of the songs on this record were actually recorded during the Tug of War sessions. Paul continues the collaboration efforts that he did in Tug of War, but this time he uses Michael Jackson. Tracks include Pipes of Peace, Say, 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 co-written and co-sung by Michael Jackson, The Other Me, The Man, co-written and co-sang by Jackson, and Sweetest Little Show. Joining Paul, we have Linda, Ringo, Denny Lane, of Wings and Eric Stewart of 10cc. And again, the album is produced by George Martin. The album did pretty well, but not nearly as good as the previous Tug of War. But an interesting thing happened because Paul worked with Michael Jackson on this record. As they were talking, Paul said to Michael, you know, a good investment is to buy music catalogs, the rights to songs. And Jackson kind of laughingly looks at him and says, someday I will own your songs. And Paul laughs it off. But guess what? Michael Jackson did in fact buy the rights to the Beatles songs. McCartney was furious. Then Paul comes up with this idea, it's time to make a film again. And this time he writes, stars, and produces in a film that he calls Give My Regards to Broad Street. Now, the plot of this film is that Paul is riding in a limo and he goes to sleep and he has this dream where his master tapes have been stolen and there's lots of misadventure trying to find them back, and then at the end of the film he wakes up from the dream. The critics did not like this film. Besides Paul and Linda appearing in it, it had Ringo and his wife Barbara Bach and even Tracy Ullman. But the film was not considered a hit. However, Paul releases an album from the film, again called Give My Regards to Broad Street. Where the film was a disaster, the album was a hit. The record contains a retrospective of McCartney's songs, some old, some newer. All of them re-recorded. The album hit #1 in the UK. In November of 1984, Paul writes and produces an animated film called Rupert and the Frog Song. The film was well received. In fact, it won a BAFTA award for Best Animated Short Film. Paul wrote a song for the film, and it's called We All Stand Together. And it was released also in the fall of 1984 as a single. Then, in the summer of 1985, Paul hits the stage at the Live Aid concert to perform Let It Be to a wildly enthusiastic worldwide audience. So in the first 5 years of 1980, there have been 7 albums that came out from Paul McCartney. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. In our next episode, we'll look at what happens between the years of 1985 and 1989 as we finish out the 80s decade. Again, I'm sure Paul's going to have lots of music for us. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin'. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.